Welcome back. Today I'm in my backyard and I'm kind of thinking about building experiments. And if we spin around and look behind me, you can see that I have a bunch of chickens that live in our backyard. And I'm particularly thinking about some experiments involving these chickens. So, one thing I'm particularly interested in with my chickens is where they lay their eggs. It turns out that they will lay their eggs at the strangest places. Sometimes our chickens lay their eggs over in these pipes behind the shed, and sometimes they'll lay them under these trees. But we built. So, I'd like to design a study that would help me understand where the chickens want to lay their eggs and what I can do to make the coop more attractive and make them want to lay their eggs there. So, today we're talking about study design. There are two types of studies we'll talk about this semester: observational studies and experimental studies. And observational studies are exactly what they sound like. You see the word observe here, and that's what they are. They're where you're studying the things that you observe. More particularly, they're situations where the researcher is not trying to change the response of the individuals in the study, versus an experiment, which is where the researcher is trying to change the responses. The researcher has some idea or some treatment that they're going to give to some of the individuals to see how that changes the way they respond in the experiment. I do most of my research in the world of education. In the world of education, an observational study might be one where I'm simply videotaping a classroom or recording students, or maybe I'm giving them a test just to see what they know. And experimental studies where I have something I want to try. I'm going to try something new, try some new test materials or some new classroom techniques, and then I'm going to somehow evaluate whether those experiments or techniques make a difference. When we think about experimental studies, we'll normally want to divide our study participants into two main groups: our control group and our treatment group. The control group is a group that's a baseline that's used for comparison. So the control group is a group that you're not making any changes to. You're letting them behave just as they would naturally. And then your treatment group, meanwhile, is the one being given the experiment, the one being given whatever the treatment is. So back to the context of teaching, the control group would have a class just like it's always taught, and the treatment group would have the class with the new materials or new teaching techniques or something involved in it. As we think about control group and treatment groups, there are some things we need to consider. We need to consider placebos, and we need to consider whether we're going to add some sort of blinding to our experiment. Placebos are where the belief in a treatment might impact your response. And it's a funny thing about humans that just believing that a medication or an experiment is going to affect you, to some degree, your body will respond to this. So in a medical setting, if you give someone a pill, even if the pill does nothing, and tell them this pill will make you feel better, a certain percentage of people, their body will respond to that and start to feel better. And don't think those people are crazy or making it up. They're normal. This is just the way we respond. And the placebo effect, it's debated and argued in literature, but it does appear to be a real effect, and it's something we have to take into consideration. And because of this, often when we split our control and our treatment group, we might want our control group to take a placebo so that this placebo effect isn't causing a difference between the control and the treatment. Sometimes we want to add a blinded experiment, and a blind experiment is just one where the participants don't know which group they're in. And you can see that might be the case, or why we might need to do that because of the placebo effect. If you tell one group you're going to be getting the treatment that'll help you feel better, and you tell the other group you're not going to get the treatment that'll help you feel better, you can see how there might be some differences just psychologically in those two groups. So a blinded experiment is where the participants don't know whether they got the treatment or not until after the experiment is over. And a double blind is where those who gather the data also don't know, because you can imagine that even unintentionally, some well-meaning researcher might go into an experiment and bias the participants. They might, by giving out the pills, they might say something or give the pills in a way that subconsciously cues in the participants to whether they should be feeling better or not. They may say something along the lines of, "Hey, don't you feel better today?" Or you really didn't feel much better, did you? And that might bias the participants in some way. So a double blind means that those gathering the data also don't know which group they're in. Any study, whether it's observational or experimental, is to try to think about lurking and confounding variables. Lurking and confounding variables are variables, either known or unknown, that might be the underlying cause of the individual's responses. Usually we call them lurking if they're unknown variables and confounding if they're known variables. For the case of this course, we're not going to make a huge deal out of making a distinction between the two. But no, lurking variables are variables that might mess up your study because you might believe that you're getting to some meaningful result, but actually something that you're not thinking about is causing the result. So this simple fact of a lurking variable tells us how important it is that we think beforehand before we try to create an experiment. And there's a couple real important principles that we try to follow. The first is randomizing the experiment. And we might start with a completely randomized experiment, which is where each individual is assigned to the treatment group or the control group by a completely randomized process. And this is typically what we try to do. Now, it turns out sometimes, and we've talked about this in class, sometimes we have situations where there are blocks of individuals or some sort of characteristics of individuals that we want to make sure are split in the treatment and the control group. And in this case, we might do what's called a randomized block experiment. And that's where the individuals are sorted into blocks first. And then once they're into blocks, we then randomly assign within each block into the treatment or control group. So, for example, if you're trying to do a study of students at a university, you might want to be really careful and make sure that you have a certain number of males in both the treatment and the control group, and females in treatment and control group, and freshmen in treatment and control group. So you might split all of your participants into blocks and then try to make sure each block has similar types of participants in each group. As we're thinking through this, just a couple phrases that end up being real important in the world of study design are what's called a randomized control trial. And this is what everyone kind of refers to as the gold standard of research. And this is where you randomly assign your individuals to your group, you've controlled as much as possible, and you run a trial for each individual. And what people really like about this is once you've randomly assigned people to each group, you've kind of done a good job of minimizing the number of lurking or confounding variables that can be present. It's not to say they can't be present, but you're doing a good job of trying to minimize them and take care of them. And the real important distinction of any research, but especially random controls trials, is that they're both randomized and repeatable. So we have randomization and replication. So a really good study, you'll be able to both randomize and you'll be able to repeat them over and over and receive similar results. So as we start thinking about designing our own studies, there are a number of things we might want to consider. We might want to ask ourselves, what's our population that we're studying? What is everyone that we would like to be in our study? Once we have our population, we ask, how am I going to collect the sample for this study? What sort of techniques am I going to use to add randomization in a way that will make me happy? How might this sample be biased? So I need to be really careful that I'm not biasing my study as I collect my sample. What variable do I wish to measure? Once I have my population defined, I need to make sure that the variable that I'm studying is really well and clearly described. And then once I have a variable, how do I measure it? Am I going to use a survey? Am I going to use some sort of measurement tools? What's my measurement instrument? And then once I've thought about my variable and how I measure it, are there any lurking variables, any variables that I haven't considered yet that I really need to think about in my study? Now that I've kind of thought about my population, my variable, lurking variables, I need to ask myself if I want to do an observational or an experimental study. And then along that lines, if it's observational, how do I observe my participants without influencing them? This can be quite difficult. As you know, in the world of education, you might think a nice observational study would put a video camera in the back of the classroom and see what happens. But it turns out even the presence of the video camera might influence or change students' behaviors. So if we're having trouble designing a good observational study, we might want to move to an experimental study. But then we need to ask ourselves, okay, do I need to create a control group? How am I going to create my control group? Am I going to use placebos? Am I going to use blinding? What sort of things am I going to use when I consider my study? And just for the sake of our conversation, let's go back to where we started as we talked about chickens. If I'm trying to decide where my chickens prefer to lay their eggs, how might I answer some of these questions? Well, what's my population? I want to be really careful about this. I might say all chickens, but do I want to say only male chickens or only female chickens? Do I want to talk about the age of the chickens? Do I want to talk about every breed of chicken or just specific breeds of chickens? Do I want to talk about chickens that live in backyards versus farms versus egg-laying factories? These things all matter, and what you decide your population is makes a big difference. Because what we're going to want to do is collect a sample. And if I want my population to be all chickens everywhere, I can't only take a sample from backyards. I have to take a sample from chickens everywhere. And if I want my sample to be all breeds of chickens, then I have to make sure, if I want my population to be all breeds of chickens, then I can't just take a sample of the breeds that I have on hand. I would have to find some more breeds. So these are all ways that we might be biasing our sample if we're not considering things like age and breeds and where the chickens are coming from. I'm thinking about what variable do I want to study? Well, my main variable is the location of the eggs. This is probably going to be a qualitative variable for my purposes because I'm just going to describe where they lay it in words or maybe have categories. A category like in the nesting box or not in the nesting box or in a shady location or in a secluded location. So I might have certain descriptors or something that I'm going to add, but it's probably going to be qualitative in descriptions. Are there any, how am I going to measure this? Well, measure it through categorization. And are there any lurking variables that I don't expect? Well, for chickens, there's actually one real big one, and that is social influences. And that is chickens watch the other chickens. And whatever they do, they kind of repeat their behavior. So it probably wouldn't work well to do this study with just one group in one place. I would probably have to do several different flocks in different locations because they all influence each other. Finally, is my study going to be observational experimental? Well, it turns out I could probably do either. I could make it observational, and that is I could put take several chickens in different locations and just try to see where they lay their eggs naturally. Or it could be experimental. I could try to set up certain types of locations. I could try to design my nesting boxes in certain ways that are meant to be appealing. And if this is the case, then I would put some chickens in a place without my appealing nesting boxes and some in a place that doesn't have it. So hopefully this exercise helps us think through how do we answer these questions for each individual study and how might we do this for our study, and then as we move forward, how might you do this for your own studies in the future. One really common study tool is that of a survey, and you'll see why surveys are so popular. It's because they're cheap and they're easy to get a hold of. It is much easier to email a whole bunch of people a survey or even call a whole bunch of people and give them a survey than it is to bring people into a building and do an experiment or observe them or set up some project with them. So surveys are great because they're cheap and you can have a lot of people involved in them. But there are problems with surveys, and so it's important before running a survey that we stop and think about what some of these problems are. The first big one is non-response. And this is something, if you've ever watched the news, people aren't really good at responding to surveys. In America, if you just try to call someone up on the phone, the response rate is probably going to be less than 10% of people that respond to a survey. I know I tend to not answer my phone, and so I don't respond to surveys when they call me. So this is a big issue because the people who do respond to the survey might be fundamentally different from those who don't, and that would bias your survey. The next one is voluntary response, and so some surveys get around this by just posting their survey on Twitter or Facebook or wherever's popular and just getting people to respond to it. But again, the people who choose to go to Twitter and Facebook and answer a question might be different than the rest of the population, those who don't choose. And so you tend to get biased responses when you do this as well. One real challenge with the survey is truthfulness. Sometimes people are not truthful because they're trying to be deceptive or something, but the next big challenge is truthfulness, and there are several reasons why someone might not be truthful in a survey. The first is maybe where you're trying to respond in a way that the interviewer would like to hear, or in a way that's socially acceptable. And so there have been times when for certain candidates or um, uh, political positions are considered more socially acceptable, and so people might tend to take those positions or support those candidates on a survey when they really don't support them in real life. But there's another element of truthfulness, and that is when you're studying sensitive information. So, for example, if I were to go ask students at LCU, hey, have you ever cheated on an exam since you've been at LCU? Well, there might be a lot of students who don't want to answer that truthfully. So you might expect there to be a bit of an issue with questions like this. And anytime you're dealing with sensitive information, information that someone might be embarrassed about, or someone might think that there would be harmful consequences for telling the truth, you have issues to deal with that. There are some ways that we get around this. One is to have some way of randomizing when you give truthful and untruthful answers. So one example might be have someone flip a coin and tell them, if the coin lands on heads, then I want you to tell the truth. And if the coin lands on tails, then I want you to not tell the truth. And there are ways of doing studies like this and having it work, but it takes a lot of care to make it work out just right. Another issue is faulty recall. And it turns out that our memories aren't near as good as we think they are. And so if you start asking surveys about things that happened in the past, just be aware that people's memories are not like video cameras. We don't have exact recall. This is an important thing to remember even when not doing a survey. A lot of times people will say things inaccurate, not because they're lying, but because they have memories that aren't accurate. And also, so if any of you ever end up in a position where you have to evaluate things in the past, maybe this is something like you're serving on a jury trial or something, just remember that memories are a lot more fallible than we might expect them to be. Another issue is influential wording. It turns out that the way you word a survey question will affect the way people respond to it. In particular, people really like to answer yes to a question. So it turns out if you say, do you agree with statement X? People will tend to say yes. And if you say, do you disagree with statement X? People will also tend to say yes. One way that people get around this is they might put two questions on a survey. One where yes is the response that agrees with statement X. The other where no is the response that agrees with statement X. And if people change their question and put both yes and no, then we know they're not just saying yes to all the questions. We know that they actually do believe whatever the statement is. Vague wording will also throw us off in a survey. So if you have some phrasing that it's unclear what it means, or some people interpret in one way and some interpret another way, that might throw your survey off entirely. Finally, we might think about how just the interviewer might influence the survey. And so it turns out that people often want to please the interviewer, and so if the interviewer kind of seems to want a certain response, or if there's some sort of a dynamic between the interviewer and the interviewee, whether it's a power dynamic, the interviewer is a boss or a supervisor, or some other dynamic, maybe the interviewer is someone that the interviewee finds attractive, these things might influence the way someone responds to a survey. So as we think about all these survey methods, it's kind of important to remember that all those surveys are wonderful, they're cheap and they're easy. There are a lot of issues, and you have to be really careful when you decide to do one. Well, I look forward to seeing you back in class where you'll get a chance to design some experiments of your own. See you then.